The morning sun painted London's streets in golden hues as 8-year-old Lily stepped out of the black taxi with her grandmother. The crisp October air made her cheeks rosy, and she pulled her bright red coat tighter around herself. Today was special. Today was her birthday trip to see the famous guards at Buckingham Palace, something she had dreamed about since watching them on television back home in Manchester. "Stay close to me, sweetheart," her grandmother whispered, taking Lily's small hand in her weathered one. The streets were already buzzing with tourists, their cameras clicking away as they made their way toward the magnificent palace gates. Lily had never seen so many people in one place before. There were families speaking languages she couldn't understand, tour groups following guides with colorful umbrellas, and street performers entertaining the crowds. As they approached the towering iron gates of Buckingham Palace, Lily's eyes grew wide with wonder. The palace stood like something from a fairy tale, its cream-colored stone walls stretching endlessly in both directions. But what caught her attention most were the guards. She had seen them in pictures and videos, but nothing had prepared her for seeing them in person. There, standing perfectly still like a statue, was one of the Queen's guards. His red uniform was so bright it seemed to glow in the morning light. The golden buttons ran in perfect lines down his chest, and his black boots shone like mirrors. But it was the tall, fuzzy black hat that made Lily gasp with excitement. She had never seen anything quite like it. "Grandma, look how still he is," Lily whispered, pressing her face between the cold iron bars of the gate. "Does he ever move?" "Her," Grandmother chuckled softly. "That's their job, love. They're protecting the Queen's home. They have to stay very still and watch for anything unusual." The guard stood about 10 feet away from where they were standing. His name was James, though of course Lily didn't know this. He had been a Queen's guard for 3 years now, and this morning's shift at the palace gates was routine for him. He had learned to block out the constant chatter of tourists, the flash of cameras, and the occasional attempt by visitors to make him smile or laugh. James took his duty seriously. Every morning he would put on his uniform with the same careful precision. First came the red tunic, then the white belt, followed by the black trousers with their perfect crease. Finally, the bearskin hat, which weighed much more than people realized. Standing perfectly still for hours required incredible discipline and physical strength, but this morning felt different. As James stood at his post, he noticed something was off. There was a strange, tingling sensation in his fingers that he tried to ignore. His breathing felt slightly labored, though he kept it controlled so no one would notice. These were symptoms he had experienced before, but never while on duty. 3 months earlier, James had been diagnosed with a mild form of epilepsy after collapsing during training. The doctors had assured him it was manageable with medication, and he had been cleared to return to duty. The episodes were rare and usually came with warning signs. But the stress of the job, the early morning hours, and the physical demands of standing motionless for long periods had begun to take their toll. Lily watched the guard with growing fascination. She noticed how his chest rose and fell with each breath, how his eyes moved slightly as they scanned the crowd, and how his fingers seemed to twitch ever so slightly against his rifle. Most people walked by without giving him a second glance after taking their photos, but Lily found herself studying every detail. "Why doesn't he talk to us, Grandma?" she asked, her voice full of curiosity rather than disappointment. "It's part of their training, dear. They're not allowed to speak or move unless there's an emergency. It's a very important job." As her grandmother explained this, Lily noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. The guard's hands were shaking. It was so slight that anyone else would have missed it, but Lily had learned to notice these things. Her younger brother Tommy had epilepsy, and she had spent countless hours watching for the warning signs that meant he was about to have a seizure. The subtle tremor in the guard's hands looked exactly like what she had seen with Tommy. There was also something about the way he was breathing, quick and shallow, that reminded her of those scary moments before her brother would collapse. But surely she was imagining things. This was a grown man, a professional soldier. He couldn't possibly be having the same problems as her little brother. The crowd around them grew thicker as more tourists arrived for the changing of the guard ceremony that would happen later. People pushed closer to the gates, trying to get the perfect photo. Children were lifted onto their parents' shoulders, and tour guides spoke loudly to their groups. But through all the noise and commotion, Lily kept her eyes fixed on the guard. James could feel his condition worsening. The tingling in his hands had spread up his arms, and there was a familiar foggy feeling creeping into his mind. He knew these signs well from his previous episodes. He had maybe 2 or 3 minutes before he would lose control completely, but his training told him to stay at his post. Guards didn't abandon their duty for personal discomfort. He tried to use the breathing techniques his doctor had taught him, taking slow, controlled breaths while maintaining his rigid posture. His years of military training helped him keep his expression neutral even as his body began to betray him. To everyone watching, he still looked like the perfect, motionless sentry. Everyone except Lily. She had seen this exact progression with Tommy dozens of times. First came the hand tremors, then the rapid breathing, followed by a distant look in his eyes. She knew that within minutes, Tommy would usually collapse into a full seizure. And right now, watching this guard, she was seeing all the same warning signs. "Grandma," Lily tugged at her grandmother's coat sleeve. "Something's wrong with the guard." Her grandmother looked at the perfectly still soldier and shook her head. "He looks fine to me, sweetheart. That's just how they're supposed to stand." But Lily wasn't convinced. She had become an expert at reading these signs because Tommy's safety often depended on it. Their parents had taught her to watch for the warning signals so she could get help quickly. She knew the difference between normal stillness and the kind of rigid tension that came before a medical emergency. The guard's breathing was definitely getting faster now, and she could see a thin line of sweat forming on his forehead despite the cool morning air. His knuckles were white from gripping his rifle, and there was a slight glazed look in his eyes that she recognized all too well. Lily felt a familiar surge of protectiveness, the same feeling she got when Tommy was in trouble. She didn't care that this was a strange adult in a foreign city. She didn't care about protocol or rules. All she knew was that someone needed help, and she might be the only person who realized it. The question was, what could an 8-year-old girl possibly do to help a Queen's Guard who wasn't allowed to move or speak? And would anyone believe her if she tried to raise the alarm? As she watched the guard's condition continue to deteriorate, Lily knew she had to find a way to communicate with him before it was too late. Lily's heart started beating faster as she watched the guard more carefully. She had learned to trust her instincts when it came to recognizing the signs that meant trouble was coming. Living with Tommy had taught her things that most kids her age never had to learn. She knew what a person looked like right before they had a seizure, and right now, this guard was showing every single warning sign she had memorized. The tremor in his hands was getting worse. What had started as barely noticeable shaking was now clear enough that she could see it from where she stood. His breathing had changed too. Instead of the slow, steady breaths of someone standing calmly, he was taking quick, shallow breaths through his nose. Lily recognized this pattern because she had seen it so many times before. "Tommy does that same breathing thing," she whispered to herself, pressing closer to the iron bars. Her grandmother was busy taking photos with her phone, pointing out different parts of the palace to other tourists who had gathered nearby. She had no idea that her granddaughter was studying the guard with the intensity of a doctor. The guard's eyes were what worried Lily the most. They had that faraway look that Tommy got right before his episodes. It was like he was looking through people instead of at them. His usual sharp, alert expression had been replaced by something distant and unfocused. She had seen this exact same look on her brother's face countless times, usually about 2 minutes before he would collapse. Lily's mind raced as she tried to remember everything her parents had taught her about Tommy's condition. The doctors had explained that seizures happen when the electrical activity in the brain got mixed up. They said it was like a storm happening inside someone's head, and there wasn't much you could do except keep the person safe until it passed. But this wasn't Tommy. This was a grown man in a uniform, standing guard at one of the most important places in England. Surely he would know if something was wrong with him. Surely someone would have noticed if he had a medical condition. Maybe she was just imagining things because she was so used to worrying about her brother. She tried to convince herself that everything was fine, but her eyes kept returning to the guard's hands. The shaking was definitely getting worse. His knuckles were white from gripping his rifle so tightly, and she could see tiny beads of sweat forming on his forehead even though the morning air was cool and crisp. "Grandma," Lily tugged at her grandmother's sleeve again, more urgently this time. "I really think something's wrong with that guard." Her grandmother looked up from her phone and glanced at the motionless figure in the red uniform. "What do you mean, love? He looks perfectly fine to me. That's how they're supposed to stand." "But look at his hands," Lily insisted, pointing through the bars. "They're shaking, just like Tommy's do before he has a fit." Her grandmother squinted at the guard, but from her angle and with all the people moving around, she couldn't see what Lily was talking about. "Sweetheart, I'm sure you're just worried because of what happens with your brother, but this man is a professional soldier. If something was wrong, he would know what to do." Lily felt frustrated. Adults never seemed to notice the things that were obvious to her. They were too busy looking at the big picture to see the small details that really mattered. But she had learned to watch for these details because Tommy's safety depended on it. Her parents had trained her to be observant, to notice when something wasn't right, and to speak up when she was concerned. The crowd around them was getting bigger as more tour groups arrived. People were taking selfies with the guard in the background, completely unaware that anything might be wrong. Children were pointing and laughing, trying to make the guard smile or move. Their parents were busy managing cameras and keeping track of their belongings. Nobody else was watching the guard the way Lily was watching him. Nobody else seemed to notice that his perfect posture was starting to waver ever so slightly. His shoulders, which had been perfectly square, were beginning to tense up in a way that reminded her of how Tommy's body would stiffen right before an episode. Lily knew from experience that once these signs started, things usually happened pretty quickly. With Tommy, they typically had about 5 minutes from the first warning signs until he would lose consciousness. She didn't know if it was the same for adults, but she suspected they didn't have much time. She looked around frantically, trying to spot someone in charge who might listen to her concerns. There were other guards visible in the distance, but they were too far away for her to reach. There were police officers somewhere nearby, but she couldn't see them through the crowd. Her grandmother was the only adult close enough to help, but she clearly wasn't taking Lily's concerns seriously. The guard's condition was getting worse by the minute. His breathing was becoming more labored, and there was a slight tremor in his legs now, too. Lily could see him struggling to maintain his rigid posture, fighting against whatever was happening inside his body. His training was keeping him upright, but she could tell it was taking every ounce of his strength and willpower. "He's fighting it," she whispered, remembering how Tommy would sometimes try to fight off his seizures when he felt them coming. Their doctor had explained that some people could sense when an episode was about to happen and would try to resist it, but it rarely worked. The brain would do what it needed to do, regardless of what the person wanted. Lily felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach, the same anxious feeling she got when she watched Tommy struggle with his condition. She hated feeling helpless when someone was in trouble, especially when she was the only one who seemed to understand what was happening. The guard's eyes were becoming more and more unfocused. She could see him trying to blink and refocus, the same way Tommy would when he was fighting the confusion that came before his seizures. His jaw was clenched tight, and there was a muscle twitching in his cheek that hadn't been there before. All around them, tourists continued their normal activities, completely oblivious to the medical emergency that was developing right in front of them. They saw what they expected to see, a perfectly disciplined guard standing at his post. They didn't see what Lily saw, a young man in distress, trying desperately to maintain his duty while his body betrayed him. Lily realized that if something was going to be done to help this guard, it would have to come from her. The adults around her weren't paying attention to the right things. They were distracted by the pageantry and the photo opportunities. But she had been trained by necessity to notice the subtle signs that meant someone was in trouble. She thought about Tommy and how scared he got during his episodes. How much it helped when someone stayed calm and let him know he wasn't alone. How important it was to have someone who understood what was happening and could keep him safe until it was over. This guard needed someone who understood he needed. Someone who could recognize what was happening and find a way to help. And right now, even though she was just 8 years old and hundreds of miles from home, Lily might be the only person in this entire crowd who truly knew what she was looking at. Lily knew she had to act fast. The guard's condition was getting worse by the second, and nobody else seemed to notice or care. She had maybe 2 minutes before something really bad happened, and she was the only one who understood what was coming. Her heart pounded as she tried to figure out what to do. She couldn't just shout for help. Who would believe an 8-year-old girl claiming that a perfectly still guard was having a medical emergency? Adults always thought kids were being dramatic or seeking attention. Even her own grandmother had dismissed her concerns just moments ago. If she started yelling about the guard being sick, people would probably think she was just another excited tourist trying to get attention. But Lily had an idea. Living with Tommy had taught her more than just how to recognize seizures. It had also taught her how to communicate when words weren't enough. When Tommy was having an episode, he couldn't always understand what people were saying to him, but he could still see and sometimes respond to the simple gestures and signs their family had learned. Basic sign language to help Tommy during his difficult moments. Nothing fancy or complicated, just simple hand signals that could tell him he was safe, that help was coming, or that he needed to sit down. The doctors had suggested it as a way to communicate during the confusing moments that often came before. And after seizures, Lily looked at the guard and made a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. She was going to try to communicate with him using the same signs they used with Tommy. If he really was having the same kind of medical problem, maybe he would understand what she was trying to tell him. First, she needed to get his attention. The guard's eyes were still moving slightly as they scanned the crowd, even though they looked unfocused and distant. She positioned herself directly in his line of sight and waited for his gaze to pass over her. When their eyes met for just a split second, she saw something that confirmed all her fears. There was confusion there, and fear, and the same lost look that Tommy got when his brain started misfirng. Very carefully. Making sure not to draw attention from the other tourists, Lily began to make small hand gestures. She started with the sign they used to tell Tommy that someone had noticed something was wrong. She pointed to her own eyes, then pointed to him, then nodded slowly. It was their way of saying, "I see you, I know something's happening." The guard's eyes focused on her for a moment longer than they should have. According to his training, he wasn't supposed to make eye contact with tourists or acknowledge them in any way. But something about this little girl's serious expression and deliberate movements caught his attention even through the fog. That was building in his mind. Lily saw the recognition in his eyes and felt a surge of hope mixed with terror. He had understood her first signal, which meant she was right about what was happening to him. Now she needed to let him know that she understood what was coming and that he needed to get somewhere safe. She made the next sign very carefully, glancing around to make sure her grandmother and the other tourists weren't watching. She touched her temple with 2 fingers, then pointed to him. This was the sign they used with Tommy to acknowledge that something was happening in his head, that his brain was having trouble. It was their way of saying, "I know this isn't your fault, and you can't control it?" The guard's eyes widened slightly. Through the increasing confusion and the strange electrical storm happening in his brain, he somehow understood that this child knew what was happening to him. It seemed impossible, but her gestures were so specific, so purposeful that they cut through the fog better than words ever could have. James had been trying to fight off the seizure through sheer willpower, hoping it would pass without anyone noticing. But this little girl had not only noticed, she seemed to understand exactly what was happening. Her calm, deliberate signals were somehow more reassuring than panic would have been. She wasn't treating him like a spectacle or a curiosity. She was treating him like someone who needed help. Lily made her third sign, the most important one. She pointed to a bench that was located about 10 feet away from his post, then made a sitting motion with her hands. This was the signal they used. To tell Tommy he needed to get to a safe place before his body stopped cooperating with him. She repeated it twice, making sure he understood. The bench was positioned near a flower bed, away from the main crowd of tourists. If he could make it there before the seizure hit, he would be less likely to hurt himself when he fell. More importantly, he would be in a place where people could help him. Without causing a huge scene that might disrupt palace security, the guard looked at the bench, then back at Lily. She could see him struggling with the decision. His military training told him never to abandon his post, no matter what. But his survival instincts were telling him that this little girl might be his only chance to avoid a dangerous situation. Lily made one more sign, the most important one of all. She placed both hands over her heart and nodded toward him. This was their family's way of saying, "You're going to be okay and you're not alone." It was the signal they gave Tommy to let him know that someone who cared about him was watching out for his safety. Something about that gesture seemed to break through the guard's confusion completely. For just a moment, his eyes cleared and he looked at her with full understanding. She was a complete stranger, a little girl from somewhere far away, but she was offering him the same kind of care and protection that someone might give to their own family member. The crowd around them continued their normal activities, taking photos and chatting excitedly about the palace. Her grandmother was now talking to another tourist about the best angles for pictures. Nobody else had any idea that a silent conversation was taking place between a little girl and a queen's guard. A conversation that might save his life. James felt the seizure building stronger now. The tingling in his hands had spread through his entire body, and the world was starting to look strange and distant. He had maybe 30 seconds before he would lose control completely. This child had somehow given him the clarity he needed. To make a choice between his duty and his safety, Lily watched as understanding dawned in the guard's eyes. She could see him weighing his options, fighting against years of training that told him to stay at his post no matter what. But she could also see the fear there, the same fear she had seen in Tommy's eyes. So many times when he felt a seizure coming and knew he couldn't stop it. She repeated the sitting gesture one more time, then pointed to herself and nodded. She was trying to tell him that if he moved to the bench, she would stay with him and make sure he wasn't alone. Just like she did with Tommy, just like family members should do for each other. Even when they had just met. The guard took one last look at his post, then at the little girl who had somehow seen through his training and his uniform to recognize a person in trouble. In that moment, James made the most difficult decision of his military career. He decided to trust a child he had never met, and he stepped away from his duty to save his own life. The moment James stepped away from his post, everything changed. The other palace guards noticed immediately. In their world, leaving your position without permission was one of the most serious things a guard could do. 2 guards who had been stationed near the palace entrance started moving toward him, their faces showing confusion and concern, but before anyone could say a word, James collapsed. His legs gave out first, just like Lily had seen happen with Tommy so many times before. 1 second he was walking toward the bench, and the next second he was falling toward the ground. His rifle clattered against the pavement as his body went rigid, and then began to shake uncontrollably. The crowd of tourists around the palace gates erupted in shocked gasps and confused murmurs. Cameras that had been taking happy photos suddenly stopped clicking. Parents pulled their children closer, not sure what they were witnessing. Some people thought it might be part of some kind of ceremony they didn't understand, but Lily knew exactly what was happening. She had seen this same scene play out dozens of times with her brother. The difference was that Tommy was small and light, easy for their parents to help and protect. James was a full-grown man in heavy uniform, and when he hit the ground, it was with a force that made everyone around him step back in alarm. "Oh my goodness," Lily's grandmother gasped, finally understanding that her granddaughter had been right all along. "That poor man is having some kind of medical emergency." Lily didn't wait for permission. She squeezed through the iron bars of the gate, her small size allowing her to fit through spaces that adults couldn't manage. She ignored her grandmother's calls to come back and ran straight toward the fallen guard. The palace security team was already responding. But they were approaching with caution, not sure what they were dealing with. Was this a medical emergency or some kind of security threat? Their training told them to secure the area first and ask questions later. But Lily's training, learned from years of caring for Tommy, told her that the first priority was keeping the person safe during the seizure. She reached James just as the worst part of the episode began. His whole body was shaking violently, and his eyes had rolled back so only the whites were showing. Foam was starting to form at the corners of his mouth, and his breathing was harsh and irregular. To most people watching, it would have looked terrifying and dangerous, but to Lily it looked familiar. Scary, yes, but familiar. She knew that despite how dramatic it appeared, the most important thing was to keep him from hurting himself while his brain sorted itself out. "Don't try to hold him down," she called out to the guards who were approaching. "You're not supposed to hold them down. Just move things away so he doesn't hit them." The security team paused, surprised to hear medical advice coming from a child. But there was something about her calm, confident tone that made them listen. This little girl clearly knew what she was talking about in a way that none of them did. Lily knelt down next to James, staying close enough to help but far enough away to avoid his flailing arms. She had learned from experience that seizures looked much worse than they actually were, and that the best thing you could do was stay calm and wait for them to end naturally. "It's okay," she said softly, even though she knew he probably couldn't hear her. "This is going to stop soon. You're going to be okay." These were the same words she always said to Tommy during his episodes, and somehow saying them made her feel calmer too. The Palace medical team arrived within minutes, their emergency bags in hand and radios crackling with urgent communications. They had been trained to handle all kinds of medical situations, but they were surprised to find a little girl already on the scene, managing the situation with remarkable composure. "How long has he been seizing?" the lead medic asked Lily as he knelt down beside them. "About 2 minutes, Lily replied without hesitation. "But I saw the signs starting about 5 minutes before he fell. His hands were shaking and he was breathing funny." The medic looked at her with new respect. Most adults couldn't give such clear, useful information during a medical emergency. This child was providing details that would help them treat their patient properly. "Do you know about seizures?" he asked while checking James's pulse and breathing. "My little brother has epilepsy," Lily explained. "I've seen this lots of times. The shaking should stop soon, and then he's going to be really confused for a while." As if on cue, James's violent shaking began to slow down. His body gradually relaxed and his breathing started to become more regular. The worst part of the seizure was over, but Lily knew from experience that the recovery period could be just as difficult. "He's going to be scared when he wakes up," she told the medic. "Tommy always gets scared because he doesn't remember what happened. And sometimes he doesn't recognize people for a few minutes." The crowd of tourists had grown larger, with everyone trying to get a closer look at what was happening. Palace security was working to keep them back, but the noise and commotion were getting louder. Lily knew that when James regained consciousness, all this chaos would only make his confusion worse. "Can you make them be quieter?" she asked one of the guards. "When my brother wakes up after a seizure, loud noises make him panic." The guard immediately understood and began directing the crowd to move further back and lower their voices. It was remarkable how quickly the adults were taking direction from this little girl who clearly knew more about the situation than any of them did. James's eyes began to flutter open, but they were unfocused and confused. He tried to sit up, but the medic gently held him down. Lily could see the panic starting to build in his face as he realized he was lying on the ground surrounded by strangers, with no memory of how he had gotten there. "Hey," Lily said softly, moving where he could see her clearly. "Remember me? I'm the little girl who was by the fence. You're okay. You had a seizure, but it's over now." Something about her voice seemed to calm him. Even in his confused state, he seemed to remember the connection they had made before his collapse. Her presence was like an anchor in the storm of confusion that always followed one of these episodes. "You did the right thing," she continued, her voice steady and reassuring. You moved away from where you were standing so you wouldn't get hurt when you fell. That was really smart. The medics were amazed at how effectively this child was communicating with their patient. James's panic was visibly decreasing as he focused on her familiar face and calm voice. His breathing was becoming more regular, and some clarity was returning. To his eyes, Lily's grandmother had finally managed to get through the crowd and was standing nearby, watching her granddaughter with a mixture of pride and amazement. She had never seen this side of Lily before, this competent, caring person who could take charge in a crisis and help someone in need. As James's mind cleared, he began to remember what had happened. He remembered the little girl's warning signs, her patient gestures, and most importantly, her promise that he wouldn't be alone. She had kept that promise, staying with him through the worst of it and helping him find his way back to himself afterward. 20 minutes later, James was sitting up on a stretcher, looking much more like himself. The color had returned to his face and his eyes were clear and focused again. The Palace medical team had checked him thoroughly and confirmed that he was stable, but they wanted to take him to the hospital for additional tests and observation. Lily had stayed by his side the entire time. Just like she always did with Tommy, she knew that the period after a seizure could be just as scary as the seizure itself. People often felt embarrassed, confused, and worried about what others had seen. Having someone familiar nearby who understood what had happened could make all the difference. "I want to thank you," James said to Lily, his voice still a little shaky but sincere. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there." Lily smiled, feeling both proud and a little shy. "My brother Tommy has seizures too. I just did what our family does for him." James looked at this remarkable little girl with wonder. "How did you know what was happening to me?" "Most adults wouldn't have recognized the signs." "Tommy taught me," Lily said simply. "When you live with someone who has epilepsy, you learn to watch for the little things. The way your hands were shaking looked exactly like his hands before he has a fit." The lead medic, who had been listening to their conversation, shook his head in amazement. "You probably saved his life," he told Lily. "If he had collapsed while standing at his post in full gear, he could have seriously injured himself. Getting him to move to a safer location before the seizure hit was exactly the right thing to do." Lily's grandmother finally made her way over to them, having been kept back by security during the medical emergency. Her eyes were filled with tears of pride as she looked at her granddaughter. "I'm sorry I didn't listen to you earlier, sweetheart. I should have known you were right." "It's okay, Grandma," Lily said, taking her grandmother's hand. "Adults don't usually notice the same things kids do. And most people don't know what seizures look like before they happen." Word of what had occurred was already spreading through the Palace security team. The head of Palace security arrived to personally thank Lily and to understand exactly what had happened. He was particularly interested in how she had managed to communicate with James without causing a scene or alerting potential troublemakers to a security vulnerability. "The hand signals were brilliant," he told her. "You found a way to warn him without anyone else knowing there was a problem." "That's exactly the kind of thinking we try to train our people to do," James smiled weakly. "She was better at reading the situation than I was. I thought I could just tough it out and wait for it to pass. But she knew I needed to get somewhere safe." The security chief made a note in his report. "We're going to use this incident to improve our training. All our guards should know the early warning signs of medical emergencies, not just how to respond after they happen." As the ambulance crew prepared to take James to the hospital, he asked if he could have a moment alone with Lily. The adults stepped back to give them some privacy, though they stayed close enough to supervise. "I need you to know something," James said, looking directly into Lily's eyes. "What you did today took real courage. You saw someone in trouble, and you didn't wait for permission or worry about whether anyone would believe you. You just helped." Lily nodded, thinking about all the times she had helped Tommy through his difficult moments. "That's what you're supposed to do when someone needs help. It doesn't matter if they're your brother or a stranger." "Exactly," James agreed. "And you did it perfectly. The way you stayed calm, the way you communicated with me, the way you took care of me during the seizure. Everything you did was exactly right. He paused for a moment, then continued. I want you to promise me something. Don't ever stop trusting your instincts. Don't let adults convince you that you're too young to notice important things. Today you proved that sometimes kids see things that grown-ups miss. Lily felt a warm glow of pride at his words. It meant a lot to have an adult tell her that her observations and actions had real value. Too often, adults dismissed kids' concerns as imagination or attention-seeking. I promise, she said solemnly, and I hope you feel better soon. As James was loaded into the ambulance, he gave Lily a small wave through the window. She waved back, feeling like she had made a real friend, even though they had only known each other for less than an hour. The crowd of tourists began to disperse as the excitement died down, but several people approached Lily and her grandmother to express their admiration for what they had witnessed. A man with a camera asked if he could take their picture for a local newspaper story about the incident. That little girl is a hero, one woman told Lily's grandmother. The way she handled that emergency was incredible. You should be very proud of her, Lily's grandmother beamed with pride. I'm proud of her, but I'm not really surprised. She's always been special when it comes to taking care of others. Later that evening, back at their hotel, Lily and her grandmother talked about everything that had happened. Her grandmother wanted to understand more about how Lily had learned to recognize the signs of seizures and why she had been so confident about what to do. It's because of Tommy, Lily explained. When someone you love has a medical condition, you learn everything you can about it. You learn to watch for warning signs because catching them early can keep the person safer. But how did you know that the guard would understand your hand signals? Her grandmother asked. Lily thought about this for a moment. I didn't know for sure. But when people are scared or confused, sometimes gestures work better than words. And I could tell he was scared even though he was trying to hide it. 3 days later, while they were still in London, a palace messenger arrived at their hotel with an envelope addressed to Lily. Inside was a handwritten letter from James, thanking her again for her help and letting her know that he was doing well. The doctors had adjusted his medication and he was expected to return to duty within a few weeks, but the real surprise came at the end of the letter. James had written to his commanding officers about what Lily had done and her story had made its way up through the ranks of palace security. Someone very important had heard about the little girl, who had helped save one of the Queen's guards. Along with James's letter was an official invitation from Buckingham Palace. Lily and her grandmother were invited to return for a private tour of the palace and a special meeting with some very important people who wanted to thank her personally for her quick thinking and compassion. As Lily held the elegant invitation in her hands, she thought about Tommy back home in Manchester. She couldn't wait to tell him about her adventure, and how all the things they had learned together about seizures had helped her save someone else. Maybe having epilepsy wasn't just something difficult that their family had to deal with. Maybe it was also something that had taught them how to help others in ways that most people never could. The little girl who had started the day just wanting to see the famous guards at Buckingham Palace was ending it as a hero who had proven that sometimes the most important things in life come from simply caring about others and having the courage to act when someone needs help.